what percentage of the land in the United States is owned by the federal government?
A third of the country.
A third of the country.
1.7 billion acres offshore, and then a third of the onshore acres, 1/3 of the onshore. It's not all BLM. It's not all Park Service. You got Department of Energy. You got the Department of Defense. But yeah, a third of the country. And so you go to some rural counties in the West, including Clark County, Las Vegas. 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of the county is owned by the federal government. It's the Forest Service, it's the Park Service, it's the Bureau of Land Management. And so how are you going to pay for schools, for law enforcement, for hospitals? How are you going to keep the kids and the grandkids coming back to those communities if the federal government's not saying, Mother, may I, with regard to economic activity?
And give me some examples of states that are particularly egregiously occupied.
Well, Idaho, I think 85%. Nevada's close to that.
And now, what's the reason that these lands are sequestered away and not allowed to be developed on? Typically, the stated reason and then the real reason.
well, I mean, essentially, one of the reasons is because those lands didn't really meet the threshold for homesteading lands. So. You go out there, you homestead, you got X number of acres, and you develop it over a period of time, and then it's yours forever.
So tell me about homesteading, because it is, I think, the story of how the west of the Mississippi was civilized to begin with.
Sure.
What is homesteading? What's the history of it, and how does it play into this?
Under the Homesteading Acts, essentially, and it wasn't just west of the Mississippi, it was east of the Mississippi, as the Louisiana Purchase and so forth, essentially saying, there was 160 acres. You got 160 acres, and if you could prove it up, and if you could develop it and make it economic in an X period of time, I forget the years, then it was yours. You got title to it. It's just like on the mining law. If you can go out on public land that's open, not parks, not a wilderness area, but public land that's open, and this is still true today, and you can make a valuable mineral discovery that's economic, then you own that. That's yours to develop, and that's the attitude of the United States. Some of this land didn't lend itself to that. Until about 1976, the attitude was, the orientation of the United States Congress and the government was disposal. We're going to get rid of this land, which is what the founders intended. Look at Illinois, for example. Illinois, until the 1850s or so, 100% was owned by the federal government. Illinois today, I think 2% is owned by the federal government. It's 99, 98% is owned by. Why? Because it got sold. It got sold in accordance with what the founders wanted to do, and the people in Illinois were crying out for it. Sell this land, make it available to our citizens. And eventually that happened. It didn't happen in the West, and the door was closed on that in 1976 when they passed what's called the Bureau of Land Management Organic Act, or the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and that says we're not going to dispose of anything anymore. So it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem for these rural communities. And even an urban community like Las Vegas, 85% of the county is owned by the Bureau of Land Management. Because of an act of Congress, we were able to sell some of that land, essentially, and we can only sell land if Congress tells us to sell it. Mm-hmm. Congress is in charge. And Congress passed a law that said, hey, we want to be able to develop these lands for schools, for communities, for homes. And so it's a very successful program, but the only reason Las Vegas is growing today is because the Bureau of Land Management is giving up its ownership of the land on which the city is built.
Mm-hmm. So to take Las Vegas as an example, I've seen these great pictures from like the 50s and 60s of the federal government literally detonating like nuclear weapons, like within view of Las Vegas. You can see kind of like the skyline, and then out there's like a big mushroom cloud. What are some of the other like really egregious examples of the federal government, doing things on that land to the detriment of the locals?
Well, I think that's sort of an anomaly. I mean, I had a case several years ago with a family in Utah The guy had mining property and ranching property, and in the lead up during World War II, when we were trying to get the Japanese troops out of those islands, the Army came to him and said, "Hey, can we explode items on your property, and we'll clean it up afterwards?" And being a patriot, he said, "Of course, we got Marines over there trying to get the Japanese out, so we don't have to have a big invasion of the mainland." And unfortunately, the government lied. It never came back and cleaned up the land. We took them to court on it, and we got one answer after another. We're not successful at it. But there's a line attributed to Chief Red Cloud of years ago, and he said, "The white man made us many promises. He only kept but one. He promised to take our land, and he took it." So it's sort of a same spirit we have out west. The idea that, hey, government, you made some promises here. You made some promises we're going to be able to graze our cattle and graze our sheep. You made a promise that we could develop mines. You made a promise that we're going to harvest our trees, be able to harvest the trees and not watch them burn down during the summer and sweep into our communities. So the government's made many promises. Congress has made many promises in that regard, and it's in statute. But we have people like Biden saying, I'm not going to do that. Look, I'll give you a good example. In October of 2019, shortly after I took over running the Bureau of Land Management, I gave a speech. I participated in a panel before the Society of Environmental Journalists, which is sort of an oxymoron. You're either a journalist or you're an environmentalist. And so I was asked a question by the Washington Post person there saying, well, all the Democrats are saying leave it in the ground, don't develop it. And I said, she said, what do you all think of that? I was on a panel. And I said, well, I'll answer the question. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. Do you have any idea how much we get from the Outer Continental Shelf and from federal lands, and how important that is to Western communities and Colorado? A third of the money in New Mexico, a third of the budget for schools comes from the oil and gas industry in New Mexico, 1/3. And I said, that's positively insane. And I said, if the Democrats really want to do this, bring it up to Congress, present it as a bill, because I think the American people will reject it. Well, of course, Biden knew that too. And he didn't bring it up as a bill, despite the fact federal law says you've got to have those sales and you got to have 4 of them every year in every Bureau of Land Management state. Biden says, I'm not going to do that. A federal judge in June of 2022 orders him to do it. He says, I'm not going to do that. In fact, June of 21, excuse me. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And it's the most lawless administration in history, where they simply say, we don't care what the courts say, or we're going to do what we want. So all these things are laid out in statute.